What is up, Trunk Slammers? It is Monday. That means, of course, it is Spicy Monday. I have a question for you on this Spicy Monday. Have you ever watched a villain arc, a sympathetic villain arc in a movie? We're talking, I don't know, Twoface from Batman, 𝗧𝗧𝘅𝗶𝗰 from Incredibles, the first movie, Megamind, like really any of these sympathetic villain arcs. In some cases, they turn into heroes. You know what I'm talking about, right? In every case, commonality between these sympathetic villain arcs, the person starts off not really being evil or a villain. And in fact, in most cases, starts off with pretty above board, altruistic, if not wholesome ambitions and goals. Things that most of us can identify with. That's why it's sympathetic. Typically through a series of events that is either indirectly or totally out of their control, they get pushed, and they get pushed too far, and they break, and they turn into bad people. And most of them, given enough time, if they don't have a redemption arc and become heroes, end up being some of the worst villains in any franchise they're in. I mean, think about some of those, like the Punisher is a good example of that. What's-his-face still from the Batman universe that wears the mask. I can't remember right now. Sorry. But you get my point. Why is that? And why am I talking to you about that today on Spicy Monday? I bring this up because I've been seeing an increase, probably just my own awareness, an increase in posts about toxic employees recently on LinkedIn, on various social media sites, on Reddit, and a lot of other places where managers and owners and executives tend to hang out. And all of this basically boils down to you need to prune out toxic employees before they poison the well with everybody else. And I don't disagree with any of that. But we go back to the sympathetic villain. Why are they toxic? What led to that? Give everybody here a margin of error of, let's say, 10% on their hiring. And then we figure the other 90% of the people that you hire, you've tried to filter them out from being toxic, and they didn't come across as toxic in the interview, and they probably didn't start off toxic on their first day or two. So what the fuck happened? Why are they now a toxic employee? Why are we at the point where internet articles are telling us we need to fire this person? And specifically, what drove them to the point of becoming a toxic employee, whether they self-identify as one or not? And I say that because remember, with most of these sympathetic villain arcs, a lot of these folks don't consider themselves to be villains until they then present themselves to the hero with whatever it is their crusade is. Now that they've had their sort of villain forged experience, they present themselves to the hero or the people saying, I am here to save you or help you from this problem I've identified. And really, it's only once they get rejected twice that they start to actually become villains. And well, I wonder how often that's happening at your organization with these so-called toxic employees. Of course, some people are just terrible. Some folks are really good at hiding that in an interview. And so obviously, yes, there's a handful of people that you are going to hire, going to make it through your interview, and well, they're just pieces of human garbage. And unfortunately, you figure that out later, and whoops, and you do the best you can to exit them out of the organization. But as we said a minute ago, assuming that that is a minority of the people that get hired at your organization, or almost never even happens, how are otherwise acceptable candidates making it through, going through their training process, and then at some point, probably within their first 3 months to a year of employment, hitting a point where all of a sudden everybody thinks they're toxic? What caused that? What was their supervillain origin story? And importantly, since I can't control other people, and neither can you, what the fuck did you do wrong? What did you and your company do wrong that pushed them over the edge and made them feel like that was their only avenue left? This is not a video to blame you. This is a video to help, I think, managers, owners, and fellow employees wake up to the fact that oftentimes we play a large part in the initial cascade of events that will trigger somebody to go from functional, normal employee to toxic employee. And having some ownership and accountability of what that may be at your organization and how that happened, and going back and doing an analysis on any employees that you're in the process of working out of the company that you deem to be toxic, I think is a really important element that we don't really tend to spend a lot of time doing, right? Because when we have somebody who we want gone, typically because they're also not performing properly anyways, and they're toxic on top of that, any feedback they give us about why they are in this spiral down where they're not productive and nobody likes them and they make every room they go into worse, we tend to write off or ignore. We tend to get defensive. We tend to get mad, and we tend to dismiss that feedback because of the source it came from, which is now that toxic employee. And if you think back to, some of the silly things that I named in some of these movies with a, sympathetic hero arc, well, think of a few of them. Like Two-Face started out as the DA that was going to clean up Gotham, and he kind of still wants to do that, even though he's a villain. It's just his methods changed and he kind of became awful and terrible. But like the original mission, everybody was pretty on board with that. They were electing him to be the DA. Or think about somebody like the Punisher. The Punisher's going around and he's saying these people are so objectively awful to society and are poisoning people or killing people that throwing them in jail or the system is just going to pump them back out. So I am simply going to remove them from society, which is a horrible, horrible way to solve that problem. But the problem he identified and wants to solve, I think we would all agree, it's pretty important and needs to be solved. And if you start going into each one of these classic villain archetypes that have that sympathetic arc, you start to realize that, like, hey, the thing that they initially spoke out about that eventually turned everyone against them, that kind of was a valid issue, and that did need solving. Their proposed solution might not have been something we agree with, and now that they've gone totally Looney Tunes, the way they're trying to solve it now, we definitely don't agree with. But you see why it's important to not just negate what it was that originally triggered them to feel that way? And I have a feeling that a lot of you aren't doing that inside your own companies. To give a different analogy, if you've been to a theme park before, and I know at least people at IT Nation were at a theme park, you'll notice that there's generally two types of people that can't get on the rides. People who are too small to safely fit in the rides, and people who are too large to safely fit in the rides. The too large is subjective. The too small isn't. And so most rides have a height barrier. And if you're not tall enough, you just simply can't get on. That style of thinking is important because it would be easier for the amusement park to simply allow all those folks to try and get on the ride and then discover once they were there by some criteria that they didn't fit before the ride started. But that's time consuming, and it leaves a lot of room for subjectivity, and it leaves a lot of room for error. And then suddenly you have toddlers flying off roller coasters, and nobody wants that. At least I don't think any of you want that. If you want that, you need to talk to someone. Or go play RollerCoaster Tycoon. So since we don't want people that the safety gear can't keep safe to get on the ride, we've explicitly put up a, pass-fail barrier. I say that all because at some point in the past that didn't exist. And if the theme park industry, so to speak, pretend that's a company, if the theme park industry had not paid attention to the feedback from people who were getting injured and operating the rides, who are watching people get injured, and it simply just said, well, those people are stupid. Anyone who gets hurt was too dumb to ride the ride, so the reason they got hurt is irrelevant because they should have known better, right? If they apply that logic, we would not have now an objective standard that prevents lots of people from getting hurt and also keeps companies from getting sued. And I know that sounds like a really, really, really silly analogy, but think about that at your own organization. If you were looking at these folks who are now behaving toxically and likely also underperforming, and you are saying, well, because they're awful, because they got hurt and they're not doing it right, any feedback or information they have is totally worthless and I'm not paying attention to it. Well, you're a theme park in the 40s and the 50s that had dangerous ass wooden roller coasters that flew off the rails. And when it happened, you sort of went, whoops, guess they should have known not to get on, those guys. Obviously, that's not the right way to do things. And that's why I bring up that I have a feeling that a lot of companies don't follow up afterwards to look backwards and sort of assess, what did we do that led this person to this behavior? I don't have a specific list of criteria to go back and look for because it is incredibly broad and subjective, and it could literally be anything. Although some common things are mismatch of expectations that usually start during the hiring process and carry through training and don't get, cleared up, or the delta isn't closed. That's a really common one. Social disconnects between the employee and the other employees, especially if the other employees have formed a clique, is another common one. There's a whole host of things, and that's not the point of the video. But when you get that feedback from that toxic employee, typically when they're in anger, when they're in pain, of why they are leaving, or why, they feel it's unfair, whatever it is, whatever their villain speech is, you got to take a minute once you get past that, once you get through the emotions of that, to go back and sift through all the points they made, because every single one of those points is absolutely valid, and it doesn't really matter who said them. I don't care how evil that villain has become. That doesn't negate the premise that they're still identifying issues. Those issues are still there. It's just that most of your staff work around them or ignore them, and that's not a solution. If you think the solution is, I only hire type A people that power through this bullshit and therefore don't turn into villains, that's pretty fucking dumb. And you're not going to grow a self-sustaining organization with a culture of accountability and excellence that's going to propagate anywhere, because it's entirely on the backs of a handful of people's rote willpower and effort, which is nonsense, because that's not scalable. That's why these people are so important, and it's important for you to figure out what happened. I don't mean that you're going to fix everything that they identify, nor are you going to agree with everything they identify as actually a problem at your company, because that's important too. If, you have 9 people in a room and 9 of them are fine with the policy and one of them thinks that you're terrible for implementing it, obviously I would go with the weight of the 9 people who are happy with it. So I wouldn't throw out the policy, but I would look at how did we fail to communicate that policy or that standard to that one person where they felt it not only had no value, but was harmful. That's important, because you did fail there. You objectively failed there. You failed once. Might have only been a 10% failure rate out of those 10 people, but you still failed there. And that's a pretty goofball simple thing to fix. And if you can identify that, figure out what you didn't communicate clearly, guess what you can do next time? And I know this is going to surprise everybody listening to this. You can go back and update or refine whatever the process was, the language, the policy, whatever it was. You can go back and update it for clarity. And now let's big brain for a minute. Now you can go back during your hiring process and you can say, okay, a small percentage of people that make it through our interview process don't understand or don't fit with this element of our company. Let's put a little extra effort to overcome that up front before we hire them, and realign our job posting, how we talk to people during the recruitment process, how we talk to people on our interviews, and see if we can't close that down to less than 10% of the people that come in here don't understand or don't fit with whatever that thing is. I'll tell you, in most cases, especially if you are a small business, where the owners or founders are still relatively involved in aspects of the day-to-day, especially HR, I can tell you right now with 100% certainty, the majority of the toxic people you are getting is 100% because of you. And it's not because you're bad, it's because you are interpreting things, especially on the front side of new people starting with your organization, with 100% of your available knowledge, accountability, and authority around whatever that is. And you are projecting and assuming everyone else around you has that same context and understanding of the concept. And I know this because every human on earth does this with everything that they're very comfortable with, that they came up with or had a part of designing. Everywhere. All humans do it. Look at any parents with a toddler, and you will observe this happening. The parent will give the toddler an objectively simple instruction, and the toddler will not understand it or not follow it, and then chaos will erupt from there, not because the toddler's bad. It's not because the parents are bad. It's because the parents are saying something that to them is common sense, doesn't need clarification. And the clarification they add is totally framed around their existing understanding of the world. To them, how could this not be any more clear? To the toddler, What you have said is clear as mud, makes no sense, doesn't align with their limited understanding of the world. They have none of that extra context, and it doesn't match their value proposition, their mood, or how they're feeling in that moment. Guess whose fault that is? It's not the toddler's fault. Yeah. Whoops. Same thing happens with employees. I'm not calling your employees toddlers. It's a silly example. And it's important if you're in that organization, especially that smaller organization, to just take a step back every time you have an employee that, despite your coaching, despite your efforts, despite maybe even a pip, just can't seem to not just be terrible. They can't seem to just not just dip into their supervillain arc. And as you start to notice that they are becoming less and less of a fit, and more staff around them don't really like being around them, once again, not telling you not to exit that person from your organization. That is probably a healthy move. What I am saying is take that time to assess what led up to this. What could we have done better? What about our company and the way we do things was not clear? Where were those gaps? Where were those assumptions? And how do we figure out to help avoid or mitigate or lessen this next time? A company that is constantly thinking that way about all the employees, but especially the employees they don't like, that are toxic, that's a company that is always going to be iterating on their values and how they communicate that to their staff. And over time, that organization will start to naturally build a cadence and a style of bringing on new people and training them that will almost certainly weed this behavior out. I'm not saying you won't still hire toxic people, but they will be able to mask their toxicity for a very long time, if possibly forever, because basically their job will be clear enough with clear enough expectations that they understand and can deliver on, that there isn't really a need to express that inner toxicity too much at work. And they'll just be superficially or minorly toxic, like I am with gossip. Have the spiciest of Mondays. I hope you have a great week. And if you are currently dealing with an employee that you feel is toxic, take that opportunity before they leave the organization to get, even if it is an incredibly acrimonious, unfriendly, and uncomfortable basically exit interview, find out why they're unhappy and what they think you did wrong and what they think sucks about your company. And don't just write it all off because the mouthpiece delivering it is a supervillain and you don't agree with them. I guarantee you there are some nuggets of truth in there that arrive at areas of what you're doing that can be improved. And everybody at the company is going to benefit from that. And their lives are all going to be improved by you taking that feedback from your worst employees and using that to go improve the process for all your employees.